Good afternoon, Brad Ganane and Zach Strickland here, coming to you live from the SONAR Market Insights Laboratory down in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We are going to go over a few of the new features and a brief overall market update here for as we get into Q4. We're actually not going to be here next Wednesday. So this is our last webinar of the year. And I think Zach would like to get us started off with our newest feature, the dual y-axis. What are we looking at here, Zach?
So I think the big thing here is like we did have a comparison tool in place to where you could pick relative on the chart here, and it would present an easy way for you to kind of compare how the movements of each one have done in sync. So it's going to take the starting position into account, and it's going to create some sort of percentage move up and down versus your starting point. Kind of the weakness of that is that it's very dependent on your starting point. So now we've offered the dual y-axis. And for those of you that are familiar with Excel, it's called a combo chart. And you can see how it's very different from what you were seeing on the relative. Now, the relative definitely has its uses when you're trying to figure out just how much they're moving in sync or in pattern with each other. But the dual y-axis really gives you this, like, what are they doing on their own specific scale? So what it's doing is you have an axis over here for your primary value that you're trying to track, and then you have an axis over here for your secondary one. You can only compare two of them, hence the name dual y-axis.
Right. And
what I've got pulled up here is our outbound tender rejection index, Los Angeles to Dallas, dropped under over the top of the DAT's Los Angeles to Dallas rate index for the last 6 months or so. And you can see this gives you a good way to note like just how much these things are moving in relation to each other. I think it makes it pretty clear cut. As one moves, the other moves in its own way. So it's not necessarily relative anymore, but I like looking at things on their own their own y-axis values.
Right. Yes. And I think I like it a little bit better too, because you can see the actual value. But I know we still do like seeing percentage and being reflected as a percent change. What maybe specific uses do you still like to look at percent change as opposed to the absolute value through the dual y-axis? Excuse me.
I still like looking at percentage changes just just to see, especially if I'm dealing with specific points in time that I want to start looking at something from. So if I feel like since June 1st, these two indices are moving in some sort of divergent pattern instead of one that kind of moves together, I want to see just how divergent they are. As this one rises, I think I did a chart not too long ago where the volume was moving at a different rate than the tender rejections. Like the volume was actually staying relatively flat and not moving. And I think it had only dropped about 4%, where the tender rejections had dropped about 53%. So that's the kind of situation where you really want to see how divergent something is, or even convergent. I mean, these are just like I had with these two indices here that obviously have some sort of relationship together, tender rejections and rates. The relative index will also kind of provide you that a similar way. You can still see they somewhat move together, but you're not going to get that kind of, baseline relativity that you'll have with the dual y-axis feature.
And one that I really like looking at from a market analysis standpoint in the dual y-axis is if you look at the head haul index when measuring the outbound inbound volume and also the tender reject percentage and how those two correlate. I think those are really powerful. I don't know if you want to pull those up quickly.
So you wanted to look at the volume index?
Yeah, if we show, for example, volume dual y-axis or maybe a specific region with the head haul index, I think that paints a really good picture looking at those side by side.
Haul and
maybe I know Indianapolis was a interesting one. or sorry, do the haul. Haul and O-try. You got tender volume up there.
Oh, sorry. .ind. There we go. And then haul.ind. So yeah, there you go. That actually is a pretty strong correlation.
Yes, and the reason that I like looking at it too, while there's certainly, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, as I'm sure you will, while there's certainly correlation in looking at some of the DAT indices that we have in here, from a price standpoint and the tender data, they're a little bit, they're giving you insights on a little bit different data points and data sets, to be specific. So the reason I like this one is because it draws a little bit of a nicer correlation as to how the difference in capacity from outbound to inbound load volume and that change and how tender rejections are affected, and shows different pressures put on markets.
Well, I'm gonna expand on what you're saying here, because I like this too, and I'm gonna tell you why. Okay. So one of the things that I really like about this, specifically with the Hall index, is that the Hall index is a derivative of outbound tender volume and then inbound tender volume. So it's basically they're related, but they shouldn't move together all the time because of the way that it's calculated. So the Hall index is the difference between outbound volume and inbound volume. So on this chart specifically, you can see anytime these kind of don't move in sync with each other, that means that it's more dependent on the inbound volume movement than the outbound volume movement. So if I were to pull up the inbound volume, I'll see a little bit different, pattern here, whereas the inbound volume is probably going to show up, something discrepant from the outbound volume in certain situations, especially as they move up. And then, that's going to tell you like, okay, so I'm having a surge of outbound volume in the freight market in this particular area. Yes. Whereas the other way, anytime that you have these two kind of moving together, that's an indication that you're probably setting up for a pretty significant capacity problem. Just because when outbound volume spikes, your head haul value goes up, your inbound volume is not able to cover that capacity into the market. So eventually that's going to show up. And again, haul is probably our most predictive data point that we have in SONAR in terms of what's going to happen in the market itself. And that's simply because it is measuring the amount of trucks going in and out of the market, which is the very nature of capacity.
And that's a good segue as well to what I want to talk about next before we may move on to the celerity widget, and talking about, for our listeners, Zach and I were discussing before this webinar. I actually had to tell him that he was correct, which I don't like to do. Several months back, we were discussing the Cass Freight Index and the volume levels via shipments that they show during this time of the year.
Look at that.
And being from my past life and working in a brokerage, I told them, no, the October through the end of the year slowdown is not real. It's one of the busiest times of the year. And I guess I'll let you, that's a good enough setup, I think, for telling you that you're correct. So I'll let you take it from there.
I mean, I know you took last week off and left me here high and dry, but I will give you a little bit of love on this. And it's not necessarily that October is always a down month. Like October can actually be a very busy month itself, but the general pattern is for the months of October, November, December to be in decline in the general freight market. If you're exposed to the spot market as a broker or expedited freight, as I have been in the past, you do get a very different idea of what's going on in the market in general. And it's not necessarily because the market volume is surging like we think it is, because we all kind of have this idea of retail kind of driving the market. Mm-hmm. Retail is simply a component of the overall freight market, and it definitely gets more time sensitive. Retail tends to have more service requirements because I don't know, again, we've talked about Amazon a few times, but as those service requirements for the consumer get tighter, the ones for the carrier get tighter.
Right.
So essentially in November and December, you're exposed to a shrinking service window, which creates a lot more activity, a lot more excitement. You think you're busy. You think the whole world is as busy as you are, when simply you're just getting more of a certain type of freight. The industrial economy, manufacturing, housing, construction, all of that slows down, specifically in the north.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you that have tuned into our monthly market webinar with our chief economist, Ibrahim Bain, he dives into this every month to kind of give a better understanding of the economy in general. It's kind of a macroeconomic look, but that's the kind of stuff that really drives the freight movements and the volumes in the industry. And
to add what we're looking at and why,
just to kind of throw up a quick comparison, I had to do the cast to kind of give a historical, but you can see that the freight market itself has kind of slowed down after Thanksgiving. You have this big push of freight around Thanksgiving. A lot of that has to do with two things. It's the end of the month, which all the shippers love to get the freight out, but it's also that big Thanksgiving inventory push. The one thing that has been driving the market this year was Los Angeles. Big container shipments coming in from China in front of the tariffs, et cetera. And all this freight came in all at once and had to go and get pushed out into the market.
And one thing to note too with the why we like looking or laying over the tender volume with the cast freight is that's typically about a month behind, I'd say, because they're working with freight invoicing, about 40 billion from shipper customers that they're processing and using to create their various indexes. So I think that's why we find it interesting and like overlaying the tender volume, because we can see kind of that real-time effect or near-time effect of what's happening in the current month or in the current week or day.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and kind of use the dual axis one more time to kind of make a quick comparison since we're on the topic of volume. One of the things I really like to do is compare the outbound tender rejection index and the outbound tender volume index, because volume drives tender rejections to a point, but it does not have a one-to-one relationship with those. I know we've talked about that kind of before, but you can clearly see it now. As our data gets older, we're exposed to more year over year. We talked about that in the previous weeks, how we now have some annual change information. If you simply put O try Y, instead, just like we have the monthly, weekly, and biweekly granularities, we now have an O try Y for certain markets, the big markets, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Chicago. They all have year over year information now. So you can see the big change since last year. And I'm going to try to pull this out a little bit further to get last year's volume was actually much lower than this year's volume is. And I'm going to pull up the trend line just to kind of give a quick percentage calculation, especially for those of you that may not know that we have this feature. It's a good way to kind of calculate quickly any kind of percentage changes. We're actually about 18% higher in terms of volume in out of the Atlanta market this year versus last year. I know a lot of the talk has been that the market has been cooling off, but now it is cooling off. But it's cooling off from an extremely hot period of time. 2018 was a tremendous time in the freight market, and now it is entering a period of time where it's just coming down off of it. It's the thing; it can't go up and to the right all the time.
Right.
Well, I guess it can, but it's not likely.
Right.
Very few.
And when you mentioned that it's not a one-to-one volume and rejection, can you explain that a little bit further and potentially other factors? And
I can. I'm not going to dive too deep into this because we have talked about this a little bit in the past, but just for those of you that haven't heard this spiel before, tender rejections are a function of volume, but also other things such as rates and market balance. It is not simply, throwing a bunch of freight into the market doesn't simply just blow it apart all the time. Or if you take it out, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be easier to find capacity all the time. There's other factors in there, such as where's the freight coming from? How many inbound loads is it getting into the areas that are having the outbound freight? When the hurricanes hit last year, we were at a point where there was less volume in the market. But what happened was everybody rushed to Houston and Florida for the recovery efforts to get good money on the FEMA loads and everything. It pulled the capacity out of the areas where people were counting on having trucks. And when that happens, the market tends to destabilize, especially when it happens in mass like that. Throw on top of that UPS and everybody else drastically underestimated their retail kind of season. So they were outsourcing a lot of their trucks. Their purchase transportation costs in the fourth quarter soared because they had to outsource. They underestimated how much capacity they would need. That spilled over into the general freight market. And that is why we see higher rejection levels in the fourth quarter of last year. And this year, we simply have not had a lot of unrecognized, when you anticipate things that are going to happen, you're prepared for them, you're willing to go out and take them. And that's what we had this year. We had Los Angeles. That was the one market in the fall that has been consistently outbound. To pull up that chart, you see Atlanta had a very seasonal pattern, very few little spikes. You did have this moment where right before Labor Day, volume spiked up, then went off again, month-end effect. But if I pull up Los Angeles and do the same thing, let's just pull up Los Angeles OTRI and OTVI, LAX, and pull out to a year. A very crazy chart. Yeah. This place, nobody knows what to do with Los Angeles. It is a very stable yet unstable market at the same time. So I have the OTVI sitting here in orange, and you can see it trends up all throughout the year. You looked at Atlanta and there was a big hump right in the middle of the year. You see this right here? There's a big hump in tender rejections right in the middle of the year in Los Angeles. It's because the capacity is somewhere else.
Interesting.
The volume did not move it entirely. The volume got consistent. And then once everybody got done with Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, covering all the other freight in the market, they figured out, well, LA still has stuff coming out of it. So they repositioned all their fleet out west. And they were able to handle it a little bit better. So when you have consistency in the market or things that aren't kind of creating this suction of trucks into certain areas, carriers can get in front of it and actually service the freight just fine. The problem is that we have no idea what 2019's freight pattern is going to be. The tariff thing will be over by March 1st. Chinese New Year hits in the beginning of the year. There's no telling. We have no idea what next year's kind of moment is going to be. 2017 had 5 or 6 of them. This year had maybe 2. Once everybody figured out the kind of the contract rate situation. That's the other part of this is about right in here. Everybody redid their contracts, figured out, we're getting paid too little. They were bailing on their shippers. They simply went to the shippers and said, hey, we can't cover your contract freight. We're you're way underpriced. The driver shortages and all the other stuff that we got to deal with, it's killing us. We'll lose money if we haul for you. So that's why we're not covering your freight right now. And the shippers realized this in the most instances and said, yeah, you're making a lot of sense there, pal. We'll go ahead and give it to you. Can you maybe lock it in for 2 years? And then the carrier said no, but they gave it a shot. Anyway, so that's the dual y-axis. That's my little spiel on outbound tender rejection index and outbound tender volume and how they are not always in total sync with each other, various reasons. But the dual y-axis really kind of makes that point real clear.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks volume is the thing. It's because it's the easiest thing for people to understand. It's the easiest thing for me to understand for sure.
Right. No, I would agree. And I know we've got about 10 or so, 15 minutes left. Let's jump to the celerity widget that we just added.
Celerity. It sounds really sexy. Celerity.
Yeah.
What could that possibly be? I'm gonna clear that out. I'm gonna go ahead and show everybody how to use or how to build one of these. So when you add your pages, if you do this and hit add page, it'll pull up one of these blank screens. And then you go over here to the plus button, open this up, and you see the news, and you click on that. And then it's going to pull up this thing right here that says select type of news you want. RSS news articles are just a stream. It's a stream of RSS feeds that we set on our end that targets things like transportation and general economics and things that we think are more in line for, what transportation people may want to see. Over here is the social media flash content button. You highlight that, click submit, and now you have access to all sorts of stuff. What it is kind of an algorithmic tool that goes out and finds real-time news articles, Twitter feeds, things like that are relevant to kind of what we have pointed to. Right now, it's heavily targeted towards financial markets and transportation. As it gets better and as we learn more about our users, we will actually be able to go in there and very much target it to our user base and what they like to read. So every time a user clicks on one of these things, we will know what kind of news is relevant to our users. I mean, if they're clicking on these tweets, you see this right here, that means that's a Twitter. That's a tweet. And somebody has retweeted this article and sent it out. Fed raises interest rates. So if I can get back to my screen.
Getting back. There you go.
There it is.
And there's a couple different ways that you can view. I think you had the actual news articles, and you clicked on one of the tweets. I know that there is also just a pure Twitter feed, essentially. And as we have a little bit of technical difficulties
let me show
here.
back up here. It won't let me close this out.
That's all right. But yeah, so you can customize it to only show Twitter feeds based on, as Zach mentioned, we've created some algorithms to point what we think are most interesting to Sonar users. And then of course, there's going to be somewhat of a process that will go through a filtering process as we get all the way back in, and you can see Zach's password as he logs in to Sonar.
.. It's my favorite. Go. It's nobody can crack it.
But yes, so now we're all the way back.
Now we're back.
You just got to look into the mind of Zach Strickland. But yeah, so as you go to the top right, that'll show the filtering process that you can do. You can click that little sort by date, and this actually pulls up the pure. So this is all minute by minute Twitter feeds and relevant information. And again, this is customizable and sizable. So if you want to create this as just a side, running feed on your current dashboard or specific page, you can certainly do so. It doesn't need to be the entire page. But that's...
Yeah, you can click on that little plus button there and you can pop this out so you don't have to keep Sonar open all day. So if you're working on multiple screens or something like that, you can actually keep this running on the side. I think that's pretty cool.
It is cool.
See what's relevant to you. You can kind of keep that open or you can close it. And that's kind of Celerity.
That's Celerity. It's in its infancy, but it is pretty cool.
It is brand new. As you can see, I haven't played with it as much as I probably should have.
Which is all right. But as we go into kind of here, the last section here of the webinar, and we're going to jump into questions as we kind of round out the year. Zach, is there anything that with all the stuff we've added on the webinars and all of the information that we've put into Sonar over this year, what are you most looking forward to in 2019?
So we do have a lot of stuff on deck for 2019. The roadmap is pretty lively. One of the I can't say with full definition what some of these things are going to look like, but we are definitely going to add more of this type of data, like the tender rejections, tender volume in the coming months. We're working on adding some additional air cargo information into Sonar, which I think will be interesting, but also kind of bulking up some of the things having to do with maritime shipping. Maritime, as we get into 2019, is going to be increasingly important, just because people are going to start kind of redefining their supply chains. They've already started that process now, but we have no idea what that's going to look like moving forward. Like LA may no longer be the largest port in 2009. I mean, I think it will be still, but at the same time, like we don't know what that looks like. This year was the year of the tariff, and things coming into LA. The Savannah market blew up. East Coast, West Coast. Those were really interesting things. We're working on kind of bulking up some of our, like our FreightWaves Baltic Index. Hopefully we're going to get a little bit more of that information coming in over the course of next year. We're working on kind of inbound volumes that, instead of prices, maybe some volume data coming in to kind of sort that out a little bit more. But I thought the FreightWaves did an awesome job this year.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to pull that up just to kind of recap. FBX CNAW, FBX CNAE, China to North American East Coast, China to North America West Coast, and then our beloved Panama spread that measures the difference between the two. And as this bad boy rises or falls, people kind of can switch their freight pattern across the coast. We saw Savannah actually have quite a bit of volume this year in October.
Actually pull up I was looking at this the other day. If you pull up the dual access with the
look at
the
Savannah.
FBX, if you pull up the FBX as well with that, there's some very interesting correlations there on the dual.
You got to change it to dual. It does not default to dual for those users out there that were wondering. And make sure I've done this a few times when I type in on the dual, when I have the dual axis setting and I'm trying to compare more than two things, it does not like that. It'll only let you compare two of them.
Yep.
But yeah, there it is. And the funny thing is that the CNAE leads Savannah here. Savannah volume, outbound volume, like shot up. That's insane.
Yeah. All the way back as early as August too.
Yeah, and then it starts to fall off and the volume starts to fall off. Savannah is heavily impacted by that kind of port activity.
And I think as most of our users, being that our product wasn't launched until essentially June, I think being armed with some of this FBX data and now knowing how to apply to some of the West Coast ports or East Coast ports, I think can be a very valuable thing moving forward in 2019.
Yeah, and
looking at some of these freight flows.
We kind of move away from China as the big supplier, even though I still think they're going to be a pretty big supplier. It's just, some of these other lanes are going to become more important to look at next year. So, Europe to North American East Coast, things like that might get a little bit beefier next year. We can already see it's shot up here at the end of the year. Again, the things to come. 2019, it's a big year.
That's right. And we're running close here. Let's grab a few questions. It looks like we have a couple from our moderator. Just kidding. She was asking us questions on the side. That's what's showing up. So if we'll stay on for a few more minutes in case any questions roll in. But otherwise, have a happy holiday, and we'll get back at you guys in 2019.
Thanks for tuning in to The Delicious Dish.
Thank you.